peaceful transition or continuation of power on January 20th, 2021. While this has been and continues to be a broad range of political, well, there has been and continues to be a broad range of political and ideological views among its members. In fact, perhaps the most distinguishing feature of the task force is its diversity of background, party affiliation, ideology, and subject matter expertise. The only outcome that this group has advocated for is that the election be free and fair. Today, it is clear that despite so much uncertainty and so many roadblocks throughout the election season, in the end, this core mission was successful. Even with considerable threats to a free, fair, and secure election, the system held, and the very worst risks of an election crisis were averted. Record numbers of Americans cast their ballots to make their voices heard. And now, even with the tragic events of last week fresh in the national memory, and even with a nation on edge, we are confident that the peaceful transition of power is finally at hand. And so while this is a cause for celebration, it is also a sober moment. Many of the threats to our elections have not gone away, and indeed, many of the challenges may only mount in the future. We also recognize that the inherent challenge in taking the long view when uncertainty remains and history is still being made by the hour. So with that in mind, we are here today to discuss the task force's collective lessons from this election and its recommendations for the future, all of which have been consolidated into a single final report on the 2020 election. These recommendations span our society, from election law and administration to social and traditional media platforms. They are intended to strengthen our elections for the future and to ensure that this sort of defensive effort is never necessary again. So to discuss these lessons and to help interpret everything that has happened over the past year, we have with us 5 task force members who I think in many ways embody the remarkable diversity and depth of experience of this group. First, we have Secretary Michael Chertoff, who was US Secretary of Homeland Security from 2005 to 2009. We have Rajiv Chandrasekaran, who is a former associate editor with the Washington Post. We have Maria Teresa Kumar, who is the president and CEO of Voto Latino Foundation. We have Jennifer Morell, who is a partner at the Elections Group and a former elections official. And finally, we have Trevor Potter, who is the president of the Campaign Legal Center and former chairman of the Federal Election Commission. Thank you, all 5 of you, for being here. They're all going to speak very briefly about one area of what happened in this election and what's in this report. And I've asked them to highlight one recommendation that stands for them among the many others that this group has put forward. After that, we're going to open up the discussion to you and your questions. So with that in mind, you can submit your questions via the Zoom chat at any time during this program. Please do include your name, your affiliation, and to which speaker the question is directed. You can also let us know if you'd like to ask your question out loud using the raise hand feature located at the bottom center of your screen. We'll call on you and you can ask your question out loud. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the 47 other extraordinary task force members, many of whom are also here on this call today. I'd encourage any of the task force members here to raise their hands in the discussion session and add any additional comments and points of emphasis that our speakers today may not have covered. But so for now, I'm going to ask Secretary Chertoff to get us started.
Thank you, Ben, and welcome everybody. I'm going to talk very briefly about the insurrection effort we had last week on Wednesday. And I think what's emerged over time, the investigation that's being reported, is that while some of it may have been opportunistic, there was at least a group that had planned in advance, perhaps to kidnap and even kill members of Congress. And I think for those people, this was nothing less than a literal effort to interfere with the final tabulation of the vote that confirmed Joe Biden's election as president of the United States. And to my mind, that adds up to sedition. It's an attempt to overthrow the US government institutions by force. What led to this? Well, the tinder that has fueled this anger on the part of some people has been building for a long time. And there can be a separate discussion about why it is people are feeling frustrated and that leads to a willingness to engage in violence. But the fuse that lit this particular explosion was a big lie. It was the lie propagated by Donald Trump and his supporters that this election was rigged and stolen and fraudulent even though repeatedly, when evidence was requested, no evidence was provided, and every court rejected these claims. But the big lie nevertheless continued to propagate and reflects a challenge in our society in terms of truth and our willingness to trust institutions. So, although it's certainly within anybody's right to argue that there's a problem with an election, to challenge it in court, at least within reason, there is no right to interfere with the actual electoral process using force and violence. So to me, one recommendation we have to have is accountability. Those people who are propagating a lie at some point need to be held accountable for the lying. And in the case of lawyers, that may mean being disbarred or sanctioned if they repeatedly go into court with what they must know is false claims. And then, of course, for those who commit acts of violence, like invading the Capitol, there will have to be a swift and tough punishment. And the good news is I think the FBI now has opened hundreds of cases, and we will see some prosecutions out of this. But without accountability, we're going to put our democracy at peril, and we cannot afford to do that any more than after 9/11, we were willing to drop our guard with respect to foreign terrorism. So with that, Ben, let me turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Secretary. I'm now going to turn it to Jennifer Morel.
Great, thanks, Ben, and thank you everybody for joining today. Always a pleasure to be here. I think at the conclusion of all of these task force briefings, I've said something similar that I think needs to be repeated again today. And that's that our state and local election officials really were the heroes of this election. In spite of extraordinary challenges created by this global pandemic, elected and appointed officials from both parties worked together to mitigate what really could have been an extraordinary crisis. They did this by instituting health and safety protocols, recruiting and training hundreds of thousands of new poll workers, and expanding early and absentee voting and other alternative voting options. And they processed and tabulated a record number of mail-in ballots. They also became crisis communicators, many for the first time. This election was a success. I could probably end there, but I think it's important to note it was secure, it was free from any systematic or significant fraud, and in spite of all these challenges, a record 160 million Americans were able to vote and have their voices heard. There are other challenges that we still need to grapple with. The widespread challenge of disinformation nearly crippled, I think, some election offices trying to deal with that and respond to that. Partisan polarization, the efforts to delegitimize and even overturn the results of this election, coupled with unprecedented intimidation of election officials. And I want to say that one more time because someone asked me the other day, is this normal that election officials are doxxed and are directly threatened and intimidated? It's not. So we still have some work to do. But focusing on the task force report, I just want to highlight two key things, really. What worked well, we need to continue to focus on, including the administrative elements that expanded voting options. We need to build on the lessons that we learned. We need to ensure that expanded options for voting can be codified and remain in place after the pandemic ends. Those options range from expanded early voting, mail-in voting, drop box, and curbside voting. And we need to improve the execution of those options in future elections as both a risk management tool as well as for the value of making voting more convenient and more secure. State and local governments should also sustain and expand the necessary policy and build infrastructure to support the smooth execution of these options. That includes pre-processing ballots and things like that. All of these recommendations that are provided in the report require, I think, one key thing, and this is where I'll end. If we're committed to democracy, we need to be willing to invest in it. And that starts with investing in the people, the administrators, the officials that are running our elections. I think it's the most important recommendation in the report. We need the funds to hire people with this knowledge, skills, and abilities to run an election in the 21st century. I'll end there, and with that, I'll turn it back over to Ben.
Thank you. And now we're going to go to Rajiv. Rajiv, how did our various social and traditional media fare in this election?
Thanks, Ben. Let me start off with traditional media. And I think it's safe to say that this was the most challenging election that the traditional media has had to cover in at least a generation. As we all know well, the election wasn't projected for 4 days. There were premature and false claims of victory by the incumbent. The initial results on election night looked very different than when the winner was projected. And we had certain instances of targeted pressure, most notably when the president and his allies directly sought to pressure Fox's decision desk when it called Arizona for Biden. That said, the media, on balance, we believe, did a good job of covering this election. And a few key points that we make in the report. One, that media and civil society prepared our voters to wait for results. And this is no sharp part to the fact that media and civil society groups helped to educate voters on why the election would take longer to be called this year. And voters were prepared to wait for results. In the days immediately after Election Day, all of the major media networks' news coverage, we believe, was patient, sober, and restrained. In addition, traditional media and social media described Trump's claim of victory as demonstrably false. And a third key point we make is that election coverage explained in those critical days on Election Day and in the critical days after, the coverage explained why results might appear to change as votes are counted. Prior to the election, there were a number of stories on what was called either the blue shift or the red mirage that helped voters understand why and how results might change on election night as absentee ballots were counted. And on election night, and until the race was called on that following Saturday, media outlets explained in a great deal of detail how much of the expected vote remained. They all explained why results were shifting as absentee votes were being counted, and they urged caution. Now let me turn to the role of social media platforms in this election cycle. Social media companies, by and large, did take steps to try to adapt their policies to be more vigilant against election-related disinformation in this cycle compared to 2016. But despite this newfound recognition to take these steps, the political landscape was littered with lies during this season. And unlike the disinformation environment of 2016, much of the disinformation observed during this cycle was driven by leading American politicians and right-wing media and its associated echo chamber. Let me highlight a couple of the challenges that we detail in the report. The first is that social media platforms did not enforce their policies against President Trump or his family members until well after the election. Labeling posts as false or questionable had very limited efficacy in curtailing the spread of disinformation and actually may have acted to confer legitimacy on other unlabeled posts. As an example, Twitter labeled 300,000 tweets as disputed or potentially misleading between October 27th and November 11th. Such posts, however, remained widely available to the public, and labels did not definitively identify objectively false information, leaving questions about the effectiveness of such labeling. We also note that disinformation about the integrity of the election, particularly lies leveled by President Trump and his allies, have decimated faith in the election process. Lastly, we note one particularly troubling example here of a platform, and that's YouTube and its unwillingness to label or remove disinformation. YouTube waited more than a month until after the election to begin removing misleading election content. We identify several recommendations. I'd like to highlight the most significant, we believe, with regard to social media platforms, and that is that in future election cycles, disinformation should be deleted rather than just simply labeled. The ability of high-profile and high-reach users to spread disinformation, we believe, poses significant risk to elections going forward. The practice of adding warning labels to posts featuring disinformation is inevitably after the fact mitigation that still allows for disinformation to spread. Thank you, and I'll turn it back over to Ben.
Thank you. And now we're going to go to Maria Teresa Kumar.
Thank you so much for this conversation. I believe that the task force was there. The North Star was to bring in different Americans with different perspectives across the political spectrum to really tackle what was of concern to us, and that was the erosion of our democracy. And in a real way, sadly, a lot of these calculations that we created, and during the course of the 9 months that I participated, came to fruition. And I think that is what really allowed us, though, at the same time to provide real assessment. And when we mentioned, for example, that the media strategy was important, it was that the media did well was a lot because of the work that was coming out of this task force. At Voto Latino, we focused on registering over 601,000 registered voters just in 8 states. We invested $34 million in these 8 states and mobilized 3.7 million low propensity voters. It is not by surprise that these states are also the ones that have the strictest barriers to participation. I am speaking of Arizona, I'm speaking of North Carolina, of Georgia, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Texas and Florida. And so for us, we realized that we had to do a twofold strategy at Voto Latino to increase the participation, because when we talk about disinformation, it was rampant in the Latino community, and it was rampant when it came to disinformation in Spanish. For the first time, we saw a strategy where the information was literally being lobbed across borders, and we had to figure out how to inoculate our community in the disinformation. So we did a 2-pronged strategy. We registered voters, but then we identified over 267 individuals that had followings as small as 3,000 in little towns to larger individuals that had over 62 million followers, and inoculated them with information on how to vote early, how to vote during a pandemic, and how to translate that vote to ensure that their vote counted. One of the things that we found at Voto Latino was that people didn't trust even mailing their ballot. And so knowing that in the Latino community, the disparities of COVID and the epidemic sadly hitting this community harder, we encouraged early voting. 30% of Latinos voted early. We had never seen that number before, and that is really changing behavior. And one of the things that we realized through the task force was that it was also just as important to have this media strategy in Spanish to make sure that older Latinos also had access to the ballot box with real information. One of the challenges, if you ask me, is that people are going to try to restrict voting. What we want to make sure is that we create uniform methods of voting across the board, and so that it's clearly defined and clearly accessible. We do not want to see the restrictions. As Jennifer mentioned, what we want to do is we want to enhance what has already been built off of. And we want to make sure that people have access. And so with that, I would encourage us as we look at, what we're to move forward. There's already talk of HR 1, which is a modernization of elections that the last Congress passed. There's already a talk of how do you encourage that, make sure it's passed, and make sure that we provide the sanctity of the voting booth for every single American. And we will continue working towards that end. Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you, Maria Teresa. Now we're going to go to Trevor Potter for a question that everybody is probably wondering, which is why do we all suddenly know so much about the Electoral College process? What happened this year?
Thank you, Ben. Yes, the Electoral College was, for better or worse, the star of the show for the last 6 weeks or so. So why indeed was this the focus of national attention, and what does it tell us going forward about what we need to do next? The answer to why it is that it was tested and its vulnerabilities became highly visible and were exploited in a way that we have never seen before. All of this started with the election night claim of victory based on obviously incomplete election results. There was an unrelenting attempt for the next 2 months to create a false narrative and delegitimize the victor in the election. There was direct presidential interference with the counting and the vote certification process in the states, such as calling members of the Michigan Election Board to get them not to vote, preventing the certification in that state, or calls that we're all now familiar with to a range of Georgia election officials to find 11,000 votes that were not there. There was a direct attack on the legitimacy of the popular vote in the states. There were calls for legislatures to overrule the voters and select the electors themselves. There was pressure on Republican legislatures and governors in states where Biden was the certified winner, with governors being asked to convene state legislatures for the purpose of having those legislatures overrule the voters and select electors pledged to the other candidate. There were lawsuits in the US Supreme Court after the electors had been selected, asking the court to intervene in the process of having those electors vote in the Electoral College. That lawsuit was supported by a majority of Republican members in the House of Representatives and Republican state attorneys generals across the country. The effect of this repeated false narrative was to move Republican popular opinion towards the idea that the election was somehow stolen, though no one could say how in any proven sense, and that the remedy for that was for Republican majority state legislatures to choose electors themselves, an action which would have violated federal law. After the electors met in their state capitals and a clear majority of the Electoral College voted for President-elect Biden, Trump supporters in some states sent rogue letters to Washington from purported Trump electors asking that they be counted instead of the electors certified by the governments of those states. Finally, we then had, on January 5 and 6, the public attempt by the president to push the vice president as presiding officer of the joint session of Congress to overrule the electors chosen by the states, refuse to recognize certain certified electors, and then that was followed by the objections from Republican members of the House and the Senate to counting the votes for some of these states, an attempt which occurred both before and after the assault and occupation of the Capitol by a violent mob trying to prevent the final piece of the Electoral College process. This series of challenges to the Electoral College system and the Electoral Count Act, which dictates how Congress shall handle challenges, was paralleled by unprecedented threats of violence against state and local election officials. Officials and election employees across the country were harassed, and they and their families received death threats and needed police protection. One of the president's attorneys said that the director of cybersecurity and infrastructure for the United States should be, quote, shot for declaring that the election had in fact been secure. It is difficult to overstate the danger that this kind of violent rhetoric poses for our democracy, not only to election officials themselves and the future willingness of Americans to help run our elections, but to the stability of our system. Are we ruled by voters and laws, or by force and violent threats. The country barely, but just barely, avoided a constitutional crisis this year. Had the outcome not been so clearly in one candidate's favor, the complicated and confusing provisions of the 120-year-old Electoral Count Act would have made things much worse. One of the task force's key recommendations is that the Electoral Count Act should be reviewed and clarified, perhaps reimagined entirely, before the next presidential election. This will not be easy given the passions of the moment, and it may be that a combination of legislative action and constitutional amendment is necessary. For these reasons, Congress should begin this review process immediately. The task force's report goes into significant detail about what this reform of the Electoral Count Act and process needs to accomplish. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you, Trevor. And thank you, all five of you. Frankly, that was a brilliant summary of a long and complex election in 30 minutes, which is really impressive. We're now going to move into questions and discussion with the audience. So for all of you, again, you could submit your questions for our speakers today by clicking the raise hand button at the center of your screen or through the chat feature. Please include your name, your affiliation, and to whom your question is directed. I'd also like to note for everyone, Secretary Chertoff has to drop off early. So if you have any questions for him, I'd encourage you to raise those right away. Just so everyone is clear, this event is on the record and being recorded. So members of the media present may feel free to use any of the participant responses in your reporting. And again, any other task force members on the call, please do raise your hands with any contributions. There's a lot of wisdom in this group that we have not captured here today. So I just ask that, if you could keep your additional comments to perhaps no more than a minute so we can get as many questions as possible. Now I'm gonna start with a question in the chat here. This is a question from Ben Anderson, who is the CEO of B Lab, which for those who don't know is the nonprofit that certifies and governs B corporations. The question is, while much of our work together is focused on the longer term, what should business leaders be doing over the next week to de-escalate real threats of violence, which disproportionately impacts Black, Indigenous, and people of color? If you have good examples of businesses acting, please share. I think I would direct this question to Secretary Chertoff first, but if anyone else has any recommendations for businesses, please do jump in.
Well, just to make sure I understand what the question is what business can do to put a damper on violence, particularly at underserved communities. I think one of the things that's happening in general, and the Business Roundtable recently spoke to this issue, is a greater emphasis by business on social responsibility. I think the acronym that some use overseas is ESG, environment, sustainability, and I forget what the G is. I think businesses need now to look at their stakeholders more broadly, not just shareholders, but customers, community members, and employees. And taking a stand against violence, against people who want to undermine constitutional values, I think is in the long run interest of businesses, even though it doesn't directly translate into the bottom line. So I do think we're going to see in general more impulse for businesses to take stands and, for example, to disassociate themselves from websites or platforms that are not being responsible in the way they deal with violent speech or hate speech.
I could also share a little bit about what we did with business in this election because we saw disinformation was such a problem. We worked with over 15 corporations, including Walmart, Nike, Steve Madden, Zoomies, and provided real tools of information that they could share in their corporate newsletters about how they could have, their employees could have access to the polls. And we did it in a way that was digestible, not just for their employees, but then their employees could also repurpose it. We had never seen businesses call us in such an effort because they saw that the election was something that was important to their employees, but also to their bottom line. I think that it's very clear that in order for a business to thrive, we need to live in a thriving, safe society, and they're very clear on that. So it will be interesting to see. We already saw the Chamber of Commerce go out against what happened most recently last week. We've seen employees being fired because they participated, but I do think that businesses are taking this much more seriously in a way that in my 16 years have not. Oftentimes people would say voter registration was too political. If anything, a lot of businesses got in line and wanted to participate more. So I imagine us seeing more of that.
If I could briefly add, we have seen a number of businesses in the last week reacting to the violence by either saying they're going to stop funding political activity for the moment, or I think in a more targeted and important way, saying they are not going to fund candidates who attempted to destabilize our constitutional system. And that's something they're clearly going to be thinking through. It is not directly aimed at the current violence, but I think it does send a message to members of Congress that if they are encouraging violence and they are encouraging a violation of the constitutional order, they cannot expect to be funded by American business that relies on the stability of our system.
And just one quick final point. It's also worth noting that in the weeks leading up to the election, several hundred leading businesses came together with some of our partners from the task force at issue 1 of the Civic Alliance to endorse the principles of a free and fair election and support the counting of every vote. That culminated in or not culminated, but was perhaps best seen in a large 2-page advertisement in USA Today with all those brand logos. It was an important first step, and I think that as we move forward, those businesses and others need to continue to take additional steps in support of fair elections and the democratic process.
Thank you all. Now I'm going to go to a question from Cameron Joseph with Vice News. Cameron?
Hi, thanks a lot for doing this. Just a questions for anyone, but Secretary Chertoff and Mr. Potter, I think you might have more insight into this. You're talking about the big lie and risks for future elections. Stepping back, not just about elections, but in general, how much damage do you think Trump has done to faith in democracy and trust in government? And given the rise in violence that we've seen, how hard is it going to be to close Pandora's box and put this away? Or is this going to be an ongoing problem for our country?
Well, Ben, I can go first. I think that Trump amplified the problem, but I think it existed prior to his becoming president. Although, he was actually a purveyor of a big lie back in the days of President Obama when he said he wasn't really born in the US. But it's really part of a more general cultural and social set of developments that involve the way the media has reported things, social media, the rise of these very bizarre conspiracy theories. What Donald Trump did is he amplified it and he gave it center stage. This is not going to go away on January 20th. And the issue of faith in institutions and democracy is, to be honest, not just an American challenge, it's a challenge around the world in other countries as well. We see it to some degree in Europe, in Asia, in the Philippines. So we need to rebuild the notion of institutional trust. And the media has a role to play in terms of not hyping or amplifying stories that are designed to attract you because they're very emotional, but actually turn out not to be false. And one of the big debates is, should the media move away from on the one hand and on the other hand into being a little more definitive about what is true and what is not true? So that saying on the one hand, the earth is round, on the other hand, some people say it's flat, may not be a helpful approach to democracy anymore. Finally, let me say, I do think we're going to see domestic terrorism continue to be a more serious threat in this country than was the case, let's say, 10 years ago. And the FBI and other members of the law enforcement community are going to have to be focused on this, as we've had to focus in the past when we've dealt with this kind of lawlessness. Over.
I would add to that I think my conclusion is that tremendous long-term damage has been done to this country and our political system by the big lie. And to be clear, the big lie was not saying, I want to make sure that the votes are counted correctly. I want to exercise my legitimate options under the law to request a recount, to have a hand count, to make sure that the machines functioned well. All of that was appropriate, as members of Congress defending that line said, but it moved as we then proceeded through the process, and the courts found there was no evidence of any significant improprieties. As then the Attorney General of the United States in this administration said, there was no evidence of any sort of systemic fraud that would have changed the election, as each of these states finished their recounts and certified their results. And at that stage, in any other situation, the candidates, not just the incumbent president as a candidate, but others have accepted that result, even if they've said, I didn't like it, or I didn't like the system which resulted in that result. But here, the continued call, as far as I can tell, through to today, is for the defeated candidate to refuse to accept the legitimacy of the election and to say, I in fact won by a landslide. This election was stolen and remains stolen. And that has meant that a significant portion of the American public who expect to believe their president and are hearing what he says still believe that somehow in some undefined way, this election was stolen. I'm still getting emails from people saying, how do I explain to my friend that the so-called ballot dump is a fiction of imagination or is something that has now been explained and carefully reviewed by election officials? And there are well-intentioned Americans who still believe this big lie. And that is a problem clearly for the legitimacy of the new president as he takes office. So I think it's going to be terrifically important that whether it is Congress or Congress through the impeachment process or witnesses, that we follow the advice of Senator Romney and insist that elected officials say that President Biden, when he becomes president, is the legitimate president because he won the election, and that it is false to say that somebody else won the election and it was stolen. And that is something that I would expect former Attorney General Barr and others to be called to speak out on, because they can best speak to that constituency of people who have been convinced otherwise over the last 2 months directly by the president.
And if I can just add to that a little bit, somewhat tangential, but when we talk about that big lie in terms of election administration, it can feel a little bit like an unwinnable situation, but there are things that election officials can do. And I think they recognize now that this burden of proof in some ways that's been created or enlarged for them is going to take, as I mentioned, that investment in thinking about how we document each step of that election process, how we verify chain of custody, ballot totals, those sorts of things, so that we have this sort of strong proof, this strong documentation, and then investing in systematic and independent, to some extent, audits to both validate that documentation as well as to ensure compliance. And the hard part, the third part that's most critical, is the communication aspect. And every single election office in this country should have the funds and resources available to hire a communications professional to help explain to their electorate, to explain to candidates those procedures, those audits, those safety mechanisms that were in place, that are in place, that continue to be enhanced, but I think clearly have been unrecognized or misunderstood in terms of the validity of the election. So again, we have some work to do, and I agree with what's been said. This has been in some ways a setback, but I think also an opportunity, again, in terms of election administration, to rethink how we go through this process.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all. I have one last question for Secretary Chertoff before he has to leave. This is from Stephen Rosenfeld with Independent Media Institute. You note accountability is essential, such as disbarring lawyers who filed election challenges based on lies. But what are we supposed to do about state attorneys general and secretaries of state who signed on to some of those suits and false claims? These people know the law and the election administration intricacies.
Well, that's what elections are for. And if you have elected attorneys general and secretaries of state, that ought to be a factor when they run for re-election and ought to be considered by the voters. If they're appointed, then it's up to the governor to decide that perhaps they need to be relieved of their duties. So I think there are remedies for these things if we're prepared to enforce them.
Thank you. And we just—
Thank you. I'm going to head off now.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Secretary Chertoff. We still have about 15 minutes left with everyone else, so I'd still encourage everyone to continue sending your questions. Now I have another question. This is from Angela Farrell Zabala with Everytown for Gun Safety, wondering about the role and consequences of armed extremists standing in the way of democratic processes more generally. Jennifer, I think this is a particularly consequential question for election administration. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's a tough one, and it's actually not, the situation this year has been extreme. It's not the first time that election officials have had to think about that in terms of gun rights, coupled with voter safety, the safety of poll workers. I think the thing we saw this year that I hope will continue was a thoughtful and careful but deliberate collaboration with local law enforcement to ensure that that protection was there, that those regular sort of visits to and patrols of election facilities and polling locations was done, but done in a way that didn't also sort of exasperate the problem of having law enforcement there while voters were waiting to vote. So from an administrative perspective, this is really a legal question, so I'll turn to the legal folks, but from an administrative perspective, it's a very careful collaboration to ensure that safety.
The only other thing I would flag is that this was the first time in 20 years that they actually allowed for poll watchers. And so the poll watchers were disproportionately targeting communities of color and intimidation. So revisiting that law and trying to see how we can reinstate it so people can feel safe and helps prevent some of this, some of the suppression that is a result of people walking around sometimes in uniform or pretend uniform to intimidate communities of color.
If I could briefly add to that, what we're talking about there is not official poll watchers designated and credentialed by the government from the parties, but instead the end of the consent decree that had been in place for decades now that prohibited political parties, specifically the RNC, from challenging voters with unofficial volunteers at polling places, which was a form of intimidation. And so I think Maria Teresa is entirely correct that that's an area that really needs to be looked at, because there are lots of reports of voters having to essentially go through a gamut of people harassing them in order to get to the polls.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go to a question from Andy Forrest, who is the CEO of Feel Good Voting. Andy, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Ben. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. My question is that one of the task force's recommendation is to delete false information on social media rather than just label it. And I'm curious about the mechanics of how that would actually happen, and if the panelists see a role for folks who are outside of that particular company platform to be involved in that. We're 100% digital, and even though we were putting out nonpartisan messages of get out the vote, we sometimes got shut down by Google and Facebook. So I'd like to hear about how, particularly social media, we could get closer to the truth without running into free speech issues.
Thank you. Rajiv, I think this is for you.
Let me start here and then invite my fellow panelists to jump in. And thanks for that question, Andy. We didn't discuss the specific mechanics of how platforms should do this. It's worth noting that the major platforms have already implemented systems for the labeling of disinformation. And it's worth noting that in most cases, the material, and I'm not saying in all cases, there certainly were many exceptions, but material labeled as demonstrably false were either a piece news articles that came from fringe sources or statements by individuals with significant followings up to and including the President of the United States. So the policies that they already have in place and the systems they have in place to label material as disinformation, we believe can simply be used in cases to then remove those posts. Now, we recognize that the removal is obviously a much more significant step. And so much more work will need to be done, both at the platform level, as well as, quite frankly, a broader national conversation about what do users of these platforms, what do those who care about free and fair elections feel is the most effective way to balance the equities between a form of free expression on private platforms, it should be noted, and the minimization of demonstrably false claims and false news that can shape both voter behavior as well as actions by individuals in the public square.
Thank you, Rajiv. Does anyone else have thoughts to add on this question?
I would just share that what the gentleman mentioned, running into having posts that were supposed to be nonpartisan taking down by Facebook and stuff, that impacted us specifically in the Georgia election. And so one of the things that we're looking to do is how do we recognize that there's accurate information in a space where Facebook itself is not considered oftentimes, I'm just using Facebook as an example, some of these platforms are not considered trusted sources, but the ACLU is considered a trusted source. So they shouldn't necessarily be taken down. So those are some of the issues that we're going to have to figure out. Some are legitimate sources that have been doing this work for a long time. They should not be equivocated to false information and carry that label, because that feeds into a distrust of legitimate sources, if that makes sense.
And I would just quickly add, we really need to grapple with both the volume and the speed at which this misinformation was spread. And I think, again, thinking about the local election officials trying to tackle that, I mean, it was a next to impossible task simply because of the quantity, the volume, and how quickly those messages were changing minute by minute.
Thank you all. Now I'm going to go to, this is a question from Lauren Kunis, who's a director of National Voter Registration Day and nonprofit Vote. At the state level, what are the opportunities and challenges for codifying and making permanent some of the voting access advancements put in place due to COVID-19? What advice do you have for advocates of these policies, particularly in red states, given how deeply politicized these issues have become? I think this, Trevor, do you have any thoughts to start us off here?
I do, to start us. I think the bad news is that the divide we have seen between the people who thought the election results were accurate and inaccurate is going to carry forward after this election in states, in state legislatures, and in pressure on legislatures. There is, if you were someone who thought the vote was stolen. The reason it was stolen, according to the big lie, is that there was too much mail-in voting, that it was insecure, that the drop boxes were an invitation to ballot stuffing, that signatures or other forms of identification were not required or reviewed. And so there will be a push to undo the efforts that were made this year to make it easier to vote, I think, in all of those areas. So that's why it becomes so important that the factual information be out there and be conveyed by reliable sources believed in those legislatures, that in fact, whether or not the legal disputes about how those procedures were adopted came out in a way that someone liked. The reality is the underlying vote was safe, secure, and we had the biggest turnout in American history. And that is something we should be proud of, and that any changes that go forward should be to regularize the process that worked well this year.
Thank you. Maria Teresa or Jennifer, do you have anything to add?
I think one of the things I would stress is having yourself, and this is going to be a little more circuitous, but being involved in the redistricting that will be taking place, and making sure in these red states that you have voice, because that is going to impact a lot of the state legislators as well and the policies they take up. And also at a more national level, it's passing a version of HR1, because in HR1, there is funding available for local state election officials to safeguard a lot of these practices. And so that will, in some cases, because it's federal dollars, create mandates that individual states will have to adhere to in order to receive that funding.
And I would just add, I spent a few years running elections in Utah, which is predominantly a single party, and saw those same sort of apprehensions when we tried to pass things like voting by mail or same-day registration. One of the things that helped was just drawing on the data and helping those legislators and folks involved in that discussion recognize that those measures were going to support their voters just as well as voters from the other party. So focusing on the states where those same options are in place, same voting equipment, same methods of casting a ballot, that support obviously candidates of both parties. So.
Just to underscore, you actually, Jennifer, you triggered something. One of the, I've been on another task force that's run out of Harvard and the Brennans and the Brookings called the Universal Voting Task Force. And the idea is, how do we actually bring universal voting to the states and to the country? And one of the interesting findings there is that what they have found is that universal voting in countries that practice it actually tones down the extremism on both sides, because it involves everybody. And so if there's methods to promote that type of, that type of practice in the country, we will see not only fairer elections, but more participation, and with the hopes of toning down that extremism that we're witnessing too.
Thank you. Now I'm going to go, this is a question from Dave Teves, who is a manager of global social impact at Starbucks. I'm clearly hearing the call for businesses to continue to advocate for free and fair elections. What are some immediate actions our employees could take to support free and fair elections, both in the short term, i.e. the next week, and throughout the next few years as we prepare for our next round of federal elections? Rajiv, I know this is an issue you've thought a lot about.
That's a good question. Obviously, there's been a lot of focus on what businesses can do when it comes to the CEOs and boards, and how companies direct political spending, the official statements that they take using the power of their brands. But for retailers, for businesses that have a large public-facing workforce like a Starbucks, I think there are a range of things that might well be considered going ahead. And I'm going to say something here. My fellow panelist Jennifer Morel may have a point of view on this, but for some people, those very brave poll workers and elections volunteers, and we knew in this cycle we needed lots of volunteers to help conduct a free and fair election. For a lot of people, they're anonymous, faceless people. We've seen some of them kind of on the background images on CNN live feeds and so forth, and too many of them in places have been unfairly maligned. But that's important work. And so, my head goes to, could some Starbucks baristas volunteer to do this in future elections and then make clear to customers on their aprons, I'm a poll worker, and make it shown that, hey, look, these are people you trust them to make your morning coffee. They're volunteering to help count votes or helping to otherwise ensure free and fair elections. And I think that there are ways in which corporate America can help to support employees with paid time off and other initiatives that then help to further demystify, normalize, and legitimize elections in the eyes of those who may be more skeptical, unfortunately, because of some of the malign activity in this cycle.
Yeah, I would agree with Rajiv 100%, and just sort of echo one of the things that's highlighted in the report. That was one of the big wins of this election. We saw civil society, we saw business, we saw nonprofit organizations really step up in that poll worker recruitment effort, and it was a huge success. It's one of the challenges that you face as an election administrator every single election. And for the first time, most state and local officials were presented with this sort of bank, right, of poll workers that had already been recruited that represented the diversity of their community, which was fantastic. I agree. We need to celebrate them. We need to honor them. We need to find ways to support the effort to step up. And I think Rajiv hit on something else that I think is really important, and I think we need to continue to emphasize in the public sphere, and that is every polling location, every ballot processing facility is full of these temporary volunteer poll workers from both parties who raise their hand, take an oath to conduct the election fairly, who are all witness to the events and activities that happened at that location. So when we talk about the big lie, we talk about the misinformation, we need to remember that we have this pool of tens of thousands of witnesses in November who know what happened and were able to, and should be able to verify and validate that.
Well, thank you. I think that is the right note for us to end on today. So I want to say thank you again, Jennifer, Rajiv, Maria Teresa, and Trevor, as well as Secretary Chertoff, for taking the time to speak with us all today on behalf of all of the task force and to share these critical lessons and recommendations for our country going forward. And to all of you in the audience, thank you so much for being with us, not just today, but many of you for at least a year now. I know you all can't see the back end of the Zoom, but the breadth and diversity of people who are here with us today and who have been with us through this long process is really extraordinary. So all of you from press, partner organizations, Congress, state and national and local governments, and especially every other part of civil and democratic society, thank you all so much for your role and your partnerships in all of us working together to ensure a free and fair election. I know very clearly that the task force has been but one tiny small part of this national effort, and everyone was essential. And so now, even though this election finally ends on Wednesday, I'd like to say again, task force members do remain available to all of you as an ongoing resource. So please do reach out and refer to our website, electiontaskforce.org, for all of the resources from the task force, including, and most importantly, this remarkable report, which I encourage all of you to read from start to finish. It's an enormous resource for our country going forward. So thank you again, all of you, for standing up for democracy in these dark days. I know the fight continues. We're going to see you all down the road. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, attendees. Take care, everyone.
Be well. Happy New Year, everyone. Stay safe.
Thank you.